So good afternoon. My name is Anthony Ryan. I am the Sales and Marketing Director at Ignatius Press. And I'm very happy today to have with me David Penault, we will discuss a new book that we published this season on Charles de Foucauld. I'm holding up the cover here. Charles de Foucauld, it's a biography by Jean-Jacques Antier. It's actually a second edition we've done of this book. And David Penault wrote the introduction to the book. So I'm very happy to have David here. We're calling the title of this podcast, Getting to Know Charles de Foucauld, The Hidden Life of a Soon-to-be Saint. And so David Penault is the Emeritus Professor of Religious Studies at Santa Clara University. He's also the author of two books published by Ignatius Press. I'm going to ask David to hold them up. The first one we did is called The Crucifix on Mecca's Front Porch, a Christian Companion for the Study of Islam. And there you see the cover that David is holding. It's a great book and great cover. And
Yes.
so that's his first book we did with David. He's an expert on Islam. I would highly encourage everyone to check that book out. And then the second book we did with David, somewhat of an unusual book. It's a novel. It's called Providence Blue, A Fantasy Quest. And there you see that book as well. And that's also another fun and exciting kind of a journey book, Providence Blue. So I'd encourage people to pick that up as well. So David, thank you for showing those. And David, thank you for joining us. And first of all, thanks for writing the introduction to this book.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It really was an honor to do so, Tony. Thank you.
So let's start off. Charles de Foucauld is not a well-known figure in the United States. I'm not sure if he's well known in France. Maybe you can tell me that. But maybe you could just give a quick overview of who he was, just before we get into the book.
Yes, and in fact, although Father Foucauld is someone who's not that well known in the United States currently, in fact, he is much better known in France, and partly because of the fact that his life is so much bound up with the whole experience of colonialism and France's relationship with North Africa and especially Algeria in the 19th and 20th century. In fact, that close political affiliation lasted until the early 1960s. And in fact, that colonial dimension was part of what slowed up the process of the canonization, which is something we can talk about more if you like. But I'll just give a very quick historical overview.
Yeah.
Father Foucauld was born in 1858 in the French city of Strasbourg to a very devout Catholic family. In fact, many of the challenges, the spiritual and intellectual challenges that Father Foucauld faced would be recognizable to us today. Because at the time he was growing up, French society and culture were being roiled by currents such as Darwinism, especially a kind of Darwinist materialism that completely downgraded the importance of God and divine human relations. France was also being troubled by rising secularism and questioning the authority of the church and traditional structures. And France was also, like much of Europe and subsequently America, France was also being challenged by what you could call so-called scientific atheism.
Sounds very similar to our age.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very much so. And in the introduction that I was asked by Ignatius to write for this book, one of the points I tried to make is that I think Father Foucauld has something to say to us today. I'll go back to that. What happened was that, again, just to do this briefly, Father Foucauld, as a young man, I would say he lost his spiritual focus. He lost direction in life, lost his faith for a period. He entered the Academy of Saint Cyr, which is sort of the equivalent of West Point here in America. However, in his studies, both in the classroom and on the parade ground, he was distracted a lot. He was someone who was already a secularist, if you like. He graduated near the bottom of his class. And by his own account, later in life, what really began what he called his reversion to the Catholicism of his youth was jihad, a declaration of holy war preached by um, uh, French Muslim militants in French North Africa. And so Foucault's military regiment was called for combat duty in Algeria. And Foucault later recalled that it was, first of all, the experience of having to care for his troops and to lead them in battle that helped to steady Foucault emotionally and pull him out of himself a bit.
Interesting.
And the second really important experience there is his contact with Muslims. He said later that the experience of being around people in a very traditional society in Algeria at that time, being around people who were clearly aware, very aware of God's presence, even if that understanding of God, of course, was not identical to the Christian, nonetheless served for him to draw his attention to at least the possibility of retrieving his relationship with God. And ultimately, he returns to France and renews his commitment to Catholicism and ultimately is ordained as a priest. He then returns to Algeria. And at that time, Algeria was a colonial possession of France. And he could have chosen, it's interesting, he could have chosen a relatively comfortable perch. He could have had a parish in Algiers, the French-Algerian capital, right on the Mediterranean. It would have been really quite comfortable. But instead, what he chose to do was to be a chaplain, an itinerant chaplain, serving the French Foreign Legion outposts in the French Sahara.
Wow.
Yeah, and he would travel on foot to offer mass and offer spiritual guidance, and also be there to help tend the wounded, in combat. So he was very much there. And at the same time, I should note that he was someone who considered himself to try to be available to everyone, Christian, Muslim, everyone. And what's particularly noteworthy is, on the one hand, he was very much a supporter of what France referred to as its civilizing mission in its colonies. He really believed in the idea of France's mission in that sense. But he was also willing to criticize his own country. He was very much a patriot. No mistake about that. He was an ardent supporter of France in its civilizing mission. But he was also willing to criticize it. And I think that one of the main points to draw attention to here is that France had outlawed the slave trade. You may be aware that Sharia, Islamic law, permits slavery. Actually, technically, Sharia still permits slavery to this day. So anyway, that's a whole discussion in itself. But in any case, there were both Tuareg and Arab Muslim slave traders active in North Africa. France outlawed the slave trade, but because of political complications and resistance from local Muslim tribes, France did not always enforce its own legislation. And what Father Foucault volunteered to do was to spend much of his time living in southern Algeria, where there was a large, substantial Black population. That Black population, the villagers were often the subject of these slave raids by the Arabs and Tuaregs. And what Father Foucault did was he would sometimes himself pay to ransom slaves, provide them employment as freedmen, do the best he could to protect them, and then also keep reminding his own government, hey, we should be enforcing this law that forbids enslavement. Okay. So just to give you an example of the fact that, yes, he was definitely a French patriot, but at the same time, he was his love of country also manifested itself in this sometimes critical attitude. And one other thing to mention here is the fact that by temperament, once he had this reversion to his home faith of Catholicism as a Christian, what he loved most was solitary devotion, especially to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist.
Hmm.
So that at night, what he really by temperament preferred to do was to spend his time in solitary prayer before the monstrance of showing the Eucharist in his chapel in this mud brick hermitage of his in the village of Tamanrasa in southern Algeria. And when he could, he would, when it was time to sleep and he'd be exhausted after being out all day ministering to people, he would sleep curled up at the foot of the altar in front of the monstrance. He called himself, like he himself says in his journals, like a dog. Okay,
that is beautiful.
Yeah, a dog for Christ. But even though by temperament he preferred that solitude, to be alone with the divine presence, he always made himself available for others, that even in the middle of the night when he would be asked for help, either by the military authorities or by local Muslims, whoever it was, he would be there for them. And the final biographical note, just to round off the portrait, is that he died at the age of 58 in 1916, killed by jihadists during a raid on his hermitage.
That was a good overview. Thank you for that. I mean, there's just a lot of things we could talk about and what you just told us, but let's just go to his devotion to the Eucharist. I think for us in America, it's very timely because, as you know, the bishops in the U.S. are preparing for this 3-year kind of revival of Eucharistic devotion, understanding and devotion in America. And I think Charles de Foucauld would be a good example for us from what you just told us about his own personal devotion to the Eucharist in person, right there with the Eucharist.
Yes.
That seems to be a crucial part of his spirituality. So that is beautiful. We could talk a little bit more about that, but I think why don't we go back first of all to the author? Can you tell the people a little bit about the author, because the author is not with us, and that's why we have the good fortune of having you talk about the book. But tell people a little bit about the author of this book, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So Jean-Jacques Antier is a French Catholic author who has written a wide variety of books on various Catholic biographical and devotional topics. And he is someone who particularly impresses me for the meticulous way in which he undertook the research for this book. If you look up the literature on Father Foucauld, you will see that there are many, many works that have been written. I've enjoyed all the ones that I've looked at. But what particularly impresses me about the author that Ignatius chose for translation, because of course the book was originally written in French, is that what Jean-Jacques Antier did was to go thoroughly through all of the surviving correspondence written by and to Father Foucauld. He went through his private journals, and what he constructs from this, and this is something that I really particularly treasured in the biography of Foucauld published by Ignatius, what Antier did in this biography is to quote extensively from the journals and from his correspondence. So it gives you a very intimate feel for what I would call Father Foucault's spiritual interiority. And that brings us back, Tony, to something that I think is so important that you just mentioned, the notion of the real presence. You know, when we read a book, we often ask, okay, so what's the takeaway for me as the reader, especially the takeaway for us as Catholic readers? Mm-hmm. Well, I think many people who are listening to this broadcast are aware of the fact that I think there's been kind of a falling away in Catholic devotion to the real presence. And so that I think often many of us who take communion, we've kind of lost track of the notion of the real presence, that Christ is really there for us, physically present, the body and blood of Christ, that's not simply a metaphor.
Right.
Now, there are many, many reasons, I think, for this lack of understanding that's going on concerning the real presence. But I think part of it is and you see this in the life of Charles de Foucauld. With Father Foucauld, in growing up, you see very clearly, and it comes across in the biography, before he came back to his Catholic faith, Father Foucauld, the young Foucauld, was subjected to enormous numbers of distractions. I mean, by his own account, as a young man, he was very much into a kind of hedonistic lifestyle. He was kind of a bonbon connoisseur, a sensualist, champagne guzzler. This is all by his own description. In other words, he was, in this age of secularism in which he grew up, he was really pulled about by what I would call an infinite number of distractions. And that describes our own age. We with our, devices and smartphones and, limitless numbers of YouTube channels. Okay, we're living in an age of infinite distractibility.
Right.
We get pulled about, and it's very hard for us to develop the kind of interior quiet in which we can carve out a space for relationship.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I really value in this biography of Foucauld. It gives that sense of Foucauld making the time to create a space for a relationship, a personal relationship with Christ in the world.
That's beautiful because as you described him, he was a man who was kind of restless. He was always getting distracted by things like a lot of us are in our culture today.
Yes.
And he really had to kind of pull himself out of that. He had to absolutely separate himself from that. Yeah. And, like we're all have to do or going to have to do if we want to develop this relationship with Christ that Foucauld developed. And I think he's a perfect role model for that today because he experienced all the same stuff that we're going through today. And yet he was able to accomplish that. And he actually went out and lived in the desert. He lived that very ascetical life that you described.
Yes.
So let's talk about that because first of all, was he a diocesan priest or what was he?
Well, here's the interesting thing. What you could describe him once he came to North Africa. His position was that of being a chaplain, a military chaplain.
Okay.
But he was not limited. This is the interesting thing. He starts off at the fortress of Beni Abbes, which is in French Algeria, right near the border with Morocco. And that was one of the major headquarters. In fact, if you look up Beni Abbes online, you'll see photographs, and it looks like something out of a Beau Geste movie. Okay, an old-fashioned French Foreign Legion outpost. Okay, but the interesting thing is, constantly what he would do would be not to limit himself to one place. What he basically did was to put that restlessness to good use. He would travel on foot, sometimes accompanying military patrols and sometimes going off on his own to minister to anyone who needed him. And he would be offering mass wherever he would go. So he would travel from outpost to outpost. He would also accompany what were called pacification tours. In other words, whenever one of the militant tribes were wreaking violence on their neighbors or whatever, and the Foreign Legion would go out on one of those expeditions, he would accompany them at great personal risk, obviously. And he would minister to the wounded, to provide sacraments to them, and just to look after the wounded. Okay, and again, what struck everyone around him is the fact that he had no regard whatsoever for his personal safety or personal comfort.
Nice.
And it's quite a contrast from the sensualism of his early years.
Well, so he was a military chaplain, but when you look at him, that doesn't look like a military chaplain there. So tell us about what happened that he ended up looking like this. I mean, did he found an order, or what happened later in his life?
Yeah, so this is the interesting thing. What we're doing right now in a brief conversation is kind of telescoping the very variegated life that he led. Right. In fact, when he first returned to France after his initial tour of duty, if you like, in French North Africa, he wound up conducting a number of spiritual experiments within the Christian faith. For example, for a while, he lived as a Cistercian Trappist.
Oh, okay.
And he traveled to the Holy Land and spent time working as a kind of laborer or voluntary factotum, helping out at various convents and monasteries. He was very much interested in what he called the hidden life. He wanted to replicate, to the extent that he could, what he called the hidden life of Jesus of Nazareth. That is those years that the gospel don't tell us about much, when Jesus, as a young man, lives in obscurity. You know, he wanted to avoid anything like a claim to fame or anything like that. Ultimately, what happens is that as he returns to North Africa, he's interested in essentially founding a new order, which didn't really bear fruit until after his death. But what he wanted was to have a very vigorous monastic life in the desert, literally, but one in which these little brothers of Jesus would be available in service to others. In other words,
like he was,
just as he was, because he was aware of the fact that, in a way, for someone of his temperament, the asceticism part of the formula was the relatively easier part. What was harder was being available to others.
I say.
So he always encouraged the notion of developing this intimate relationship with God in the real presence. That's always central, because he understood that out of that intimacy with God comes the inner strength to be available for others.
I see. So he combined the contemplative and the active life, kind of.
Yes, very much so. And he is someone who, I mean, if we had more time, I'd also mention the fact that he had a close relationship with and was a great inspiration to a French Catholic scholar of Islam named Louis Massignon. And Massignon, who, like Foucault, was someone who had studied Islam but had fallen away from his Catholic faith. Massignon and many other people in France actually found himself being called back to his Catholic faith through his relationship with Father Foucault.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it's
beautiful. But so you say he wanted to found a monastic order. It didn't really happen until after his life. So what is his legacy today?
Yeah, so his legacy today is, well, first of all, it extends in various ways. First of all, with the Little Brothers of Jesus, this order, which remains relatively small, but one that continues to this day. And I would also say that it's important to keep in mind, you may be aware of this, that in May of 2001, Pope St. John Paul II visited Damascus as a historic visit to the Grand Mosque, Islamic place of worship, in Damascus. I've actually have at various points visited that mosque myself. It has quite an interesting history to it, because of the fact that it had originally been a Christian chapel in honor of John the Baptist. Okay, so quite a long history. But in any case, when Pope John Paul II, when he visited that mosque, in a gesture of interfaith dialogue with Muslim population worldwide, and he talked about the notion, when St. John Paul II talked about the concept of Muslim Christian dialogue, he explicitly cited the names of Father Foucault and Louis Massignon. In other words, both French Catholics, both of them people who had studied Islam and had relationships with Muslims to try to build points of conversation between them. And what the Pope stated in that historic visit in 2001 was that he said, "I am placing Muslim Christian dialogue under the aegis of, or in the name of, Father Foucault, blessed Father Foucault, and Louis Massignon."
That's beautiful. That is
quite a
beautiful.
legacy.
So David, so he's going to be canonized as saint on May 15th by Pope Francis. That's a big thing in the church whenever there's a canonization. Apparently there was some controversy surrounding his canonization. Could you tell us briefly about that?
Yes, you see, this has to do with the French colonial legacy. And what I noted when I was doing my own research to write the introduction to this new edition published by Ignatius, what I came across is the fact that there have been various scholars, self-described activists, who objected to the canonization on the grounds that Father Foucauld was someone who served the French military, who was a French patriot, who believed in France's civilizing mission. And so if you look through some of these publications objecting to Father Foucault's legacy, they say things to the effect of what we should be doing is dismantling colonialist figures. In other words, I see this as part of what I would call a cancel culture.
Right.
And the idea is to, at least, this is how I view it. In the view of such people, what happens is we hold various historical figures from the past to the standards of concepts, and especially vocabulary, of today.
Right.
And if they're off by a millimeter,
yeah,
heaven help you in that case.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
And
so
that's
what the so-called controversy was.
Yeah, and it also has to do with the fact that there was one has to keep in mind that after World War II, especially in the 1950s, you have a colonial war going on in Algeria, that ultimately led to Algeria becoming independent and leaving the French Empire. And so there was a lot. I mean, that was one reason why the canonization process took so long.
Okay.
And it's interesting to keep in mind the fact, and this is another kind of footnote here, that with regard to the whole canonization process, that I think it was in 1967 that Pope Paul VI, he paid homage to Father Foucauld by noting the very interesting fact that while Father Foucauld was, doing his missionary work, being a witness to the faith in North Africa, it was Father Foucauld who was documenting the culture of the Tuaregs. Now, the Tuaregs are indigenous people of Algeria. This is the population that was there before the Arabs came, before the time of Arab conquests, in the time of the 7th century.
Wow.
And one of the things that Father Foucauld did, because he was a scholar as well as a missionary and a hermit, Father Foucauld constructed a giant multi-thousand-page dictionary, French Tuareg. He collected Tuareg folklore and folk sayings and so forth, and part of building a bridge to the local culture. And what Pope Paul VI noted was that once Algeria acquired independence, the nationalist government, which described itself as Arab, which is the majority population, of course, today, right? The Pope noted that actually the Tuareg were going through discrimination because they're an ethnic minority. And so the Pope pointed out that actually what Father Foucauld did was not only standing up for the minority blacks, but also, trying to document the Tuareg culture that, after independence was not being given the attention it should because the Tuaregs were suffering discrimination at the hand of the nationalist Arab government.
That's amazing.
Complicated story.
Very interesting facet. A man of many interesting facets, Charles de Foucauld. We've basically just been able to touch on them today. But David, thank you for a chance to talk to you about this book. Thank you for all the work you did on your introduction to the book.
You're very welcome.
And I want to encourage people to check out David's books, both his novel Providence Blue. Can you hold that up again? I want people to see that really great cover and great book.
There it is.
And then also David's book, Crucifix on Mecca's Front Porch, if you can hold that up. And that obviously ties in with somewhat what we're talking about with Charles de Foucauld, the whole idea of Christianity and Islam, and the whole view, as David shows, of Christians' companion to the study of Islam, and how there's definitely connections with what we talked about with Charles de Foucauld. So let me just hold up the book that we're showing or discussing today, the cover. And this is really the definitive biography of Charles de Foucauld. We're honored to have it. If you're looking for one book on Charles de Foucauld, I would say this is it. And David gave you a little taste of it today. It's very thorough. As David said, the author did great research. He had access to the files for his canonization. He actually interviewed witnesses, people that knew Foucauld. He checked all his writings out. Very thorough book. So thank you, David, for talking to us about this great book today and for your introduction to the book.
It's a pleasure. Always great to talk with you and to be able to work with Ignatius Press.
We look forward to continuing that. Thank you. God bless you.
Hey, God bless. Take care now.
Thank you.